Adam Mitchell was a man known for his hard work, dedication, and love for his family. At 45 years old, he had built a solid life in the quiet town of Cedar Creek, a small community nestled in the heart of the Midwest. He worked as a construction foreman, a job that was physically demanding but one that Adam took pride in. His reputation as a reliable, honest man was well earned, and his colleagues respected him for his integrity and leadership. Adam had always been a hands-on father and a loving husband. He married Sarah Mitchell, his high school sweetheart, when they were both 22. Sarah, a gentle and nurturing woman, was the kind of person who put others before herself. She worked part-time as a nurse at the local clinic and was known in the community for her kindness and caring nature. Sarah was 43 years old, a few years younger than Adam, and she had always been the glue that held their family together. Their daughter, Camilla, was the light of their lives. At 14, Camilla was a bright, curious, and sensitive teenager. She had her mother's kindness and her father's determination. She excelled in school, particularly in the arts, and had a passion for painting and drawing. Camilla had always been close to both of her parents, but she shared a special bond with her father. Adam had been her hero growing up. She admired his strength, his work ethic, and the way he always made time for her, no matter how busy he was. The Mitchell family lived in a modest but comfortable home on the outskirts of Cedar Creek. Their house was surrounded by woods, and it was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and life moved at a slower pace. It was a peaceful life, one that Adam and Sarah had worked hard to build, but beneath the surface the cracks were beginning to show. Adam's life took a drastic turn one cold winter morning when he was involved in a serious car accident. On his way to work, his truck skidded on a patch of ice and slammed into a tree. The impact left Adam with a severe back injury that required surgery and a long recovery period. The injury was more than just physical. It marked the beginning of a downward spiral that would eventually consume him. After the accident, Adam was prescribed powerful painkillers to manage the excruciating pain in his back. At first, the medication was a necessity. The pain was unbearable, and without the pills, Adam could barely function. But as the weeks turned into months, Adam found himself relying on the medication more and more. What started as a means to manage pain quickly turned into an escape from the growing sense of despair that was taking hold of him. Adam had always been a man who took pride in his ability to provide for his family. The injury not only took away his ability to work, but also chipped away at his sense of self-worth. He felt useless, a burden to his family, and the medication became his way of numbing the pain, both physical and emotional. As his dependency on the pills grew, so did his tolerance. The prescribed dosage no longer provided relief, and Adam began taking more than was recommended. He convinced himself that he needed the pills to function, to be the man he once was. Sarah noticed the change in her husband almost immediately. The man who had once been so full of life and energy was now withdrawn and distant. Adam's mood swings became more frequent, and he began to isolate himself from his family. He spent hours locked away in their bedroom, claiming that he needed to rest, but Sarah knew something was wrong. She tried to talk to him to understand what was happening, but Adam was defensive and irritable. He assured her that he was fine, that he just needed time to recover, but Sarah wasn't convinced. Camilla, too, noticed the change in her father. The man who had once been her rock was now a shadow of his former self. Adam no longer had the patience to help her with her homework or listen to her stories about school. He snapped at her over the smallest things, and the warm, reassuring presence she had always known was replaced by a cold, distant figure who seemed lost in his own world. Camilla tried to reach out to him, to reconnect with the father she had always adored, but Adam pushed her away. As the months passed, Adam's dependency on the painkillers deepened. He began to run out of his prescriptions early, and when that happened, he turned to more desperate measures. He started visiting multiple doctors, lying about his pain to get more prescriptions. When that no longer worked, he began buying pills on the black market. His addiction was no longer just a means to manage pain, it had become a compulsion, something he couldn't control. Sarah, desperate to help her husband, did everything she could to get him into rehab. She pleaded with him to seek help, to think about their family and the future, but Adam refused. He insisted that he didn't have a problem, that he could quit any time he wanted. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the toll the addiction was taking on him, on their family, and she was terrified of what might happen if things continued to spiral out of control. Adam's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was no longer the calm, level-headed man Sarah had married. He was prone to fits of rage, often triggered by the smallest things. He accused Sarah of not understanding his pain, of being unsupportive, and his paranoia grew. He began to believe that Sarah and Camilla were talking about him behind his back, conspiring against him. The once loving and trusting relationship they had shared was now strained to the breaking point. Camilla, who had always been close to her father, was heartbroken by the change in him. She didn't understand why he was acting the way he was, why he was so angry all the time. She missed the man who used to take her fishing on weekends, who taught her how to ride a bike, who was always there with a kind word and a smile. Now she was afraid to be around him, afraid of what he might say or do. The tension in the house was palpable, and Camilla found herself retreating into her own world, trying to escape the chaos that had taken over her home. Despite everything, Sarah and Camilla tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Sarah continued to go to work, taking on extra shifts to make up for the income they had lost since Adam could no longer work. Camilla focused on her schoolwork, throwing herself into her art as a way to cope with the stress at home. But the situation was taking its toll on both of them. The once happy, close-knit family was now fragmented, each of them dealing with the fallout of Adam's addiction in their own way. The turning point came one night when Adam's behavior became more erratic than ever before. He had been drinking, something he rarely did before the accident, and was in a foul mood. Sarah had taken Camilla to her room, hoping to keep her away from Adam's temper, but it didn't work. Adam stormed into Camilla's room, accusing her of conspiring with her mother to turn against him. Camilla, terrified and confused, tried to reason with him, but it was no use. Adam's mind was clouded by the drugs and alcohol, and he was beyond reason. In a fit of rage, Adam lashed out, knocking over a lamp and shattering it against the wall. Camilla screamed, and Sarah rushed into the room trying to calm Adam down, but he was too far gone, too consumed by his anger and paranoia. He yelled at Sarah, accusing her of turning Camilla against him, of trying to ruin his life. Sarah, desperate to protect her daughter, stood between Adam and Camilla, pleading with him to stop, to think about what he was doing. For a moment it seemed like Adam might calm down. He looked at Sarah and Camilla, the two people he loved most in the world, and the realization of what he had become seemed to hit him. But the moment passed quickly and the anger returned. He pushed Sarah aside and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Sarah and Camilla were left standing there, shaken and scared, unsure of what to do next. After that night, things only got worse. Adam's outbursts became more frequent, and Sarah realized that she couldn't keep Camilla in the house any longer. She had to protect her daughter, even if it meant leaving Adam behind. She began making plans to leave, to take Camilla and start over somewhere else. But Adam, in his paranoia, began to suspect that something was going on. He became even more controlling, monitoring Sarah's every move, convinced that she was planning to leave him. The situation reached a breaking point when Sarah tried to take Camilla to stay with her sister for a few days. Adam, enraged by the idea of them leaving, blocked the door and refused to let them go. He accused Sarah of trying to take Camilla away from him, of trying to destroy their family. Sarah, terrified for her and her daughter's safety, knew she had to get out. She managed to convince Adam to let them go, promising that they would come back, but she had no intention of returning. As Sarah and Camilla drove away, Adam stood in the doorway, watching them leave. The reality of what had happened seemed to hit him all at once. He had driven his wife and daughter away, the two people he loved most in the world, and he had no one to blame but himself. The weight of his actions, of what his addiction had done to his family, began to sink in, but by then it was too late. As Sarah and Camilla drove away from the only home they had ever known, the weight of their decision pressed down heavily on both of them. The winter sky was overcast, mirroring the gloom that had settled over their lives. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension. She stole a glance at Camilla, who sat silently in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The young girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sadness. The innocence that had once defined her was now overshadowed by the trauma of the past months. The drive to Sarah's sister's house was long and silent, punctuated only by the occasional sniffle from Camilla as she tried to hold back tears. Sarah's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Had she made the right decision? Was there any hope left for Adam? But as she glanced again at her daughter, she knew deep down that leaving was the only option. She had to protect Camilla, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, back in the house they had just fled, Adam stood motionless in the doorway, the cold wind whipping around him. The reality of his situation began to sink in, but his mind, clouded by the effects of drugs and alcohol, twisted that reality into something darker. In his distorted perception, he was the victim. He convinced himself that Sarah had betrayed him, that she had poisoned Camilla against him, that they had abandoned him when he needed them most. The once loving father and husband now saw only betrayal and loss. Over the following days, Adam's descent into darkness accelerated. Left alone in the house, the silence was deafening. The once cozy home that had been filled with laughter and love now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on him. Without his family there to ground him, Adam's addiction took full control. He stopped trying to ration his pills, instead consuming them in reckless amounts, chasing a numbness that never seemed to last long enough. The more he took, the more he needed, and soon even the black market supply was not enough. Desperation drove Adam to actions he never would have imagined. He began selling off possessions to fund his habit. The television, the tools he had once used with pride, even pieces of furniture, all disappeared to feed the insatiable hunger for the drugs that had taken over his life. The house, once a symbol of the life he had built, became a hollow shell reflecting the emptiness that had consumed him. Despite his increasing isolation, Adam's paranoia grew. He was convinced that Sarah and Camilla were conspiring against him, plotting to keep him away from his daughter. He imagined them laughing at him, moving on with their lives while he spiraled further into despair. The line between reality and delusion blurred, and Adam became trapped in a cycle of anger, despair, and hopelessness. In her sister's home, Sarah tried to create a sense of normalcy for Camilla, but it was impossible to escape the shadow that Adam's absence cast over their lives. Sarah's sister, Emily, was a compassionate woman, understanding of the situation but worried about the toll it was taking on both mother and daughter. Emily offered comfort and support, but she could see the pain etched into Sarah's face, the sleepless nights spent worrying about what Adam might do. Camilla, on the other hand, struggled to adapt to the new environment. She missed her father, or at least the father he used to be. The trauma of their departure haunted her, and she found it difficult to concentrate on her schoolwork or enjoy the activities she once loved. She withdrew from her friends, isolating herself as she tried to process the overwhelming emotions she was experiencing. The fear that Adam would come after them was a constant presence in her mind, and the guilt of leaving him behind gnawed at her. Sarah knew that they couldn't stay with Emily forever. They needed a long-term solution, a place where they could rebuild their lives away from the memories of Cedar Creek. She began looking for a small apartment, a place where they could start over. But finding affordable housing in a safe area was difficult, and Sarah was already stretched thin financially. The extra shifts she had been working were barely enough to cover their basic needs, and the thought of starting from scratch was daunting. The stress took a toll on Sarah's health. She lost weight, her face became gaunt, and the circles under her eyes darkened. She tried to be strong for Camilla, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but the uncertainty of their situation made it hard to keep up the facade. The pain of leaving Adam behind, of abandoning the man she had loved for so many years, weighed heavily on her. She couldn't help but wonder if there was more she could have done, if she had failed him in some way. But as much as she struggled with guilt and doubt, Sarah knew that she had made the right decision. Every time she looked at Camilla, saw the fear in her daughter's eyes, she was reminded of why they had left. Adam was no longer the man she had married, and staying with him would have only led to more pain and suffering. She had to protect Camilla, even if it meant sacrificing the life they had known. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found a small apartment on the outskirts of a nearby town. It wasn't much, just a modest 2-bedroom unit in an older building, but it was a place where they could start over. With Emily's help, they moved in, bringing with them only the essentials. Sarah tried to make the new apartment feel like home, hanging up some of Camilla's artwork and arranging the few pieces of furniture they had. But the emptiness of the place, both physically and emotionally, was hard to ignore. Camilla struggled to adjust to her new life. She missed her friends, her school, and most of all, she missed her father. She couldn't reconcile the man who had always been her protector with the angry, erratic person he had become. The memories of their life before the accident haunted her, and she often found herself lying awake at night, wondering if things would ever go back to the way they were. The fear that her father would find them, that he would hurt her or her mother, was a constant presence in her mind. Despite Sarah's best efforts, the tension between mother and daughter grew. Camilla resented the fact that they had left, that they were living in a strange place with none of the comforts of home. She missed the life they had in Cedar Creek, and she couldn't understand why they had to leave everything behind. The arguments between them became more frequent, fueled by the stress and fear that both were experiencing. Sarah tried to be patient, to understand what Camilla was going through, but her own frustration and exhaustion made it difficult. Adam, meanwhile, was sinking deeper into his addiction and despair. The days blurred together as he alternated between drug-fueled stupors and moments of terrifying clarity. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah and Camilla. In those moments, the realization of what he had lost would hit him like a physical blow, and he would spiral further into self-destruction. He stopped caring about anything other than his next fix. The house fell into disrepair, the bills piled up, and Adam's once strong and healthy body began to wither away. He lost weight, his skin took on a sickly pallor, and his eyes were hollow and bloodshot. The man who had once been the pillar of his family was now a ghost, haunting the ruins of his former life. In his darkest moments, Adam would lash out at the memories of his family. He blamed Sarah for leaving, for taking Camilla away from him. He convinced himself that they had never truly loved him, that they had abandoned him when he needed them most. The anger and bitterness consumed him, and he became obsessed with the idea of getting them back, of making them pay for what they had done to him. The final breaking point came one night when Adam received a call from his old boss, checking in on him after not hearing from him for months. The conversation was short and awkward, with Adam barely able to string together coherent sentences. His boss, concerned, suggested that Adam consider checking into a rehab facility, that there were people who cared about him and wanted to help. But Adam, in his drug-addled state, took the suggestion as an insult. He saw it as confirmation that everyone was against him, that they all believed he was beyond saving. That night, Adam's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He was convinced that Sarah had turned everyone against him, that she was telling lies to keep him away from Camilla. In a fit of rage, he decided that he needed to find them, to confront Sarah and force her to bring Camilla back. The thought of losing his daughter forever was too much to bear, and in his twisted logic, he believed that the only way to fix things was to get them back, no matter the cost. Adam's mind, now completely consumed by his addiction and paranoia, concocted a plan. He would track down Sarah and Camilla, and once he found them, he would make them see that they couldn't live without him. He believed that once they saw him, they would realize their mistake, that they would come back to him and they could be a family again. The thought of seeing his daughter, of holding her again, became an obsession, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. As Adam drove through the desolate roads, his thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm of anger, desperation, and longing. The cold winter night had enveloped the landscape in darkness, with only the faint glow of the moonlight breaking through the thick clouds. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity, his mind fixated on one goal, finding Sarah and Camilla. The painkillers he had consumed earlier in the evening coursed through his veins, blurring his thoughts but heightening his obsession. He was no longer the man he once was. He had become a hollow shell driven by a single desperate purpose. The small town where Sarah and Camilla now lived was nearly 2 hours away from Cedar Creek. As Adam approached the outskirts, the familiar signs of civilization began to appear: streetlights, closed shops, and the occasional car passing by. But these sights did nothing to calm the storm within him. Every mile he traveled only fueled his determination. He was certain that once he found them, everything would be right again. He would make Sarah see reason, make her understand that they needed to be together. In his twisted logic, he believed that their reunion was the only way to restore order to the chaos that had consumed his life. Sarah, too, was trying to rebuild their lives. She had found a job at a local grocery store, working long hours to make ends meet. The work was exhausting, but it provided her with a sense of purpose and stability. She had begun to feel hopeful that, with time, they could move on from the trauma of the past. But beneath the surface, Sarah still carried the weight of fear and guilt. She knew that Adam wasn't well, that he was still out there somewhere, and the thought of what he might do if he found them was a constant shadow over her thoughts. That night, as the cold wind howled outside, Sarah and Camilla sat together in the small living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light on their faces. They were watching a movie, something light-hearted to take their minds off the worries of the day. For a moment, it almost felt like things were normal again, like they had finally found a way to move forward. But that fragile sense of normalcy was shattered when the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot outside caught Sarah's attention. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced at the clock. It was too late for visitors. Camilla noticed the change in her mother's expression and immediately felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She had learned to read Sarah's emotions over the past few months, and she could tell that something was wrong. The two of them sat in tense silence, listening as the car door slammed shut and heavy footsteps approached the building. Sarah's mind raced with fear. It couldn't be him, she told herself. He couldn't have found them. But deep down, she knew that was exactly what had happened. Her worst fears were coming true, and she didn't know what to do. The thought of Adam finding them, of him forcing his way back into their lives, filled her with a terror she hadn't felt since the night they left Cedar Creek. The footsteps stopped outside their door, and for a moment there was only silence. Sarah and Camilla exchanged a terrified glance, neither of them daring to speak. Then there was a loud, insistent knock on the door. The sound echoed through the apartment, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly stood up, motioning for Camilla to stay where she was. She approached the door cautiously, her hands trembling as she reached for the doorknob. Before she could even open the door, Adam's voice called out from the other side. "Sarah, it's me. Open the door." The sound of his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was slurred, a sign that he was under the influence, but there was something else there too, an edge of desperation and anger that she hadn't heard before. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure of what to do. Part of her wanted to ignore him, to pretend they weren't home, but she knew that wouldn't stop him. Adam wasn't in his right mind, and she feared what he might do if she didn't let him in. "Please, Sarah, I just want to talk," Adam continued, his voice growing more insistent. "I know you're in there. I need to see Camilla." Sarah's breath caught in her throat at the mention of Camilla's name. She glanced back at her daughter, who was watching her with wide, fearful eyes. Sarah knew she had to protect Camilla, but she also knew that she couldn't keep the door closed forever. If Adam was determined to get in, he would find a way, and she didn't want to risk him making a scene or hurting someone else in the process. Taking a deep breath, Sarah unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, enough to see Adam's face. He looked worse than she had imagined, disheveled, gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. The man who had once been her husband, the father of her child, was now barely recognizable. The sight of him filled her with a mixture of pity and fear. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just want to talk," Adam repeated, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please, Sarah, I need to see Camilla. I need to explain everything." Sarah shook her head, her heart aching at the desperation in his voice. "Adam, this isn't the time. You're not well. You need help." "I don't need help," Adam snapped, his tone suddenly turning hostile. "I need my family back. You took her away from me, Sarah. You had no right." "Adam, you need to leave," Sarah said firmly, trying to keep her fear from showing. "This isn't helping anyone. You need to go home and get help." "Home?" Adam scoffed. "You mean the empty house you left me in?" "There's nothing for me there, Sarah. You and Camilla are my home. I'm not leaving until you let me see her." Behind Sarah, Camilla was trembling, her heart racing with fear. She could hear every word her father was saying, and the anger in his voice terrified her. She wanted to run, to hide, but she knew there was nowhere to go. Her mother was standing between her and the man who used to be her protector, and she didn't know what would happen next. Seeing no other option, Sarah opened the door a little wider, still blocking Adam from coming inside. "Camilla is scared, Adam. She's scared of you. You need to understand that." Adam's face contorted with pain at Sarah's words. "Scared of me? I would never hurt her, Sarah. You know that." "Do I?" Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "Because the man I married wouldn't be here right now, in the middle of the night, scaring his own daughter. The man I married wouldn't have become addicted to drugs and pushed his family away. That man is gone, Adam, and I don't know who you are anymore." For a moment Adam was silent, his eyes filling with tears. The realization of what he had become, of what he had lost, seemed to hit him all at once. But just as quickly the anger returned, fueled by the drugs and the desperation that had consumed him. He took a step forward, pushing against the door, forcing Sarah to take a step back. "Let me in, Sarah," Adam demanded, his voice rising. "I need to see her. I need to see my daughter." Sarah's fear turned to panic as Adam pushed his way inside. She knew she couldn't physically stop him, and the thought of what he might do once he was inside filled her with terror. She tried to reason with him to calm him down, but Adam was beyond reason. His eyes were wild, his movements erratic, and Sarah knew that the situation was spiraling out of control. "Adam, please, just calm down," Sarah pleaded, backing away from him. "We can talk about this, but you need to calm down." But Adam wasn't listening. His focus was on Camilla, who was now standing frozen in the living room, her eyes wide with fear. Seeing her, Adam's expression softened for a moment, and he took a step towards her, his hand outstretched. "Camilla," he said softly, his voice trembling. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here. Everything's going to be okay now." But Camilla didn't move. She didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. The loving father she had known was gone, replaced by this stranger who had invaded their home. The fear that had been building inside her finally broke, and she took a step back, shaking her head. "Daddy, please," Camilla whispered. The words hit Adam like a punch to the gut. The daughter he had always protected, the child he loved more than anything in the world, was now afraid of him. The realization of what he had become, of how far he had fallen, was too much for him to bear. He stumbled back, his hands shaking as he tried to process the reality of the situation. For a brief moment it seemed like Adam might listen, that he might leave and give them the space they needed. But then the anger returned, fueled by the drugs and the overwhelming emotions he couldn't control. He lashed out, knocking over a lamp in his frustration, the crash of glass shattering the tense silence in the room. Sarah flinched, instinctively moving to shield Camilla. "Adam, stop. Please, you're going to hurt someone." But Adam was beyond reason. The rage and despair had consumed him completely, and he was no longer in control of his actions. He grabbed a nearby chair, lifting it as if to throw it, but then hesitated, his gaze flickering between Sarah and Camilla. In that moment, the last remnants of the man he once was seemed to surface, and he froze, the chair still in his hands. "Adam, put it down," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling. "Please, just put it down." For a long moment, Adam stood there, breathing heavily, his mind warring with itself. Then slowly he lowered the chair, setting it down with shaking hands. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a crushing sense of defeat. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sorrow. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know what else to do." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't move. She couldn't bring herself to comfort him, not after everything that had happened. She wanted to believe that the man she had loved was still in there somewhere, but she knew that things could never go back to the way they were. "Adam, you need to leave," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "You need help, real help, and we can't give that to you. Please, for Camilla's sake, just go." Adam looked at her, his expression one of utter devastation. He knew she was right, but the thought of leaving them, of walking away from the only family he had ever known, was more than he could bear. But as he looked at Camilla, saw the fear in her eyes, he realized that staying would only make things worse. He had lost them, and there was no way to fix it. With a heavy heart, Adam nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He turned and walked towards the door, his movements slow and labored, as if the weight of his actions was physically crushing him. He paused at the door, glancing back at Sarah and Camilla one last time, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, before stepping out into the cold night. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sarah and Camilla standing in the silence of the now empty apartment. The tension that had filled the room dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of relief and sadness. Sarah wrapped her arms around Camilla, pulling her close as they both began to cry, the weight of what had just happened finally crashing down on them. For a long time they stood there, holding each other, trying to process the events of the night. The man who had once been their protector, their provider, was now gone, leaving behind only the shattered remnants of the family they had once been. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the scars of the past would take time to heal, but in that moment they took solace in the fact that they still had each other. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to Camilla. They would get through this, they would find a way to rebuild their lives, and they would never let fear control them again. The journey would be long and hard, but together they would find a way to move forward.